Okay. It's a good thing. Now they can get married. All right. What a difference in a trip across Europe. I had thought this separation would teach Corey something. I had not known how much it would teach me. The miles that had rolled away so easily beneath my tires before now tugged and called to me, every one a mile farther from her. The border crossing, too, was harder on me than usual. Whether it was that for the first time I wanted desperately not to be caught, not to be detained, not to let anything keep me from that date in Alkmaar, or whether the stories in the refugee camps had made me particularly fearful of Hungary, I do not know. However, once again, God made seeing eyes blind, and at last I was rolling along through the Hungarian countryside. The road I was following wound along the Danube. It was beautiful, just as the song said, although its color, instead of being blue, was deep milk chocolate brown. I began to feel hungry and decided to stop by the river for lunch. So I pulled off the road, drove down a sandy lane, stopped in a little clearing at the water's edge, and got out the makings of my picnic. In order to get the stove out, I actually had to move several boxes of tracts that the border guards had just overlooked. No sooner had I opened a can of peas and carrots when I heard a roar. I looked up. A speedboat was cutting through the water toward me at full throttle, throwing a wake higher than the boat itself. In the bow stood a soldier with a drawn machine gun. In the last possible instant, the boat swerved and coasted to a neat landing at the river's edge. Now I saw that there were two other soldiers in the boat. The man in the front leapt ashore, followed by another one. "Lord," I said very softly as they approached, "help me refuse to yield to fear." The first soldier kept the machine gun on me while the other ran to the car. I kept stirring the peas and carrots as I heard the door of the car open. I began talking, speaking Dutch, which I felt sure these men would not understand. "Well, sir," I said, stirring, "it certainly is nice of you to drop in this way." The soldier stared stonily. "As you could see," I went on, "I'm preparing to eat." Behind me I heard the other door of the car open. I reached into my picnic box and drew out 2 extra plates. "Would you care to join me?" I raised my eyebrows and waved my hand in a gesture of invitation. The soldier shook his head brusquely as if to say he wasn't going to be bribed. At least not for a mess of peas and carrots, eh? I thought. I could hear the other soldier poking around. Any moment now he would certainly ask about those boxes. "Well," I said aloud, "if you don't mind, I'm going to go ahead and eat while the food is hot." I spooned the vegetables on my plate and then faced a dilemma. Should I say grace? In the camps they had told me that Christians were particularly suspect and hungry now, since many had taken leading roles in the revolt. But no, here was a chance to witness to 3 men. In a gesture far more deliberate than normal, I bowed my head, folded my hands, and said a long and hearty thanksgiving for the food I was about to eat. An amazing thing happened. While I prayed, there was no sound from the soldier inspecting my car. Just as soon as I had finished, the door slammed and I heard the sound of boots coming rapidly toward me. I picked up my fork and took a bite of peas. For a moment, both soldiers stood over me. Then abruptly they whirled. Without looking behind them, they ran down to their boat, jumped in, and roared off in a spray of white. Budapest was the loveliest city I'd yet seen in my travels. 2 ancient towns, Buda and Pest, see, I bet you didn't know that, were built on the 2 shores of the Danube. But signs of the revolt were everywhere. Buildings were pockmarked with bullet holes, trees ripped up, tram rails twisted. I'd been given the address of a Professor B., a man who held an excellent position in a famous school in Budapest. When I asked him if he would act as my interpreter, I did not appreciate the terrible significance of his answer. "Of course, brother," he said, "we are in this together." That decision cost my friend his livelihood. Professor B. was overjoyed with the gift of Bibles. He said they were almost unattainable. He told me that there were scores of churches open and functioning as best as they could. I could be just as busy as I chose, speaking and distributing the books, providing I didn't mind taking a few risks. "A few risks?" I said. "Well, you see, the revolt is so recent. The authorities think every church supper is hatching a plot. Those who had suffered most," he said, "were the pastors. Most of those in Budapest had been in serious trouble with the regime. About a third had spent time in prison, some for as long as 6 years. Each preacher had to have his permit renewed every 2 months, and this was a regulation that kept them in constant tension. Professor B. took me to visit a friend of his, a Reformed pastor, who opened the door to us cautiously and looked up and down the hall before letting us in. His apartment was filled with lampshades. Some were completed, some just covered frames, some in the process of being rather crudely painted with street scenes from Budapest. This man, I learned, had been summarily dismissed from his pulpit. No reason given. He was not even allowed to sit on the platform during services. Afraid that his very presence would get others in trouble, he and his wife had withdrawn from the fellowship altogether. In order to keep his family from starving, he was painting lampshades. He worked from early morning until late at night to supply their most basic needs. After we left, I asked Professor B how typical this pastor's plight was. Fairly typical among the churches that do not compromise, he said, but many compromise. They adjust to the regime, not only in politics, but in the basics of the faith, so that they become little more than arms of the government. I asked Professor B to take me to such a church, and he told me that the pastor of one of them was officiating at a public school festival that afternoon. Sure enough, the pastor was on the reviewing stand. In a few minutes, he came over to talk with us. Perhaps a third of that group, he said, pointing to a row of youngsters lined up on the school lawn, belonged to our church. Every child was wearing a brilliant red scarf, a symbol, he explained, of good citizenship. One of the requirements for the scarf was a proper attitude toward the religious superstitions of their parents. All right. Well, we are reading God Smuggler in the Teen Sunday School class. I'll tell you one of the reasons that we read in our Sunday School class, and probably the adult Sunday School class should as well. One reason, young people don't read. They just don't. When I was a kid, I used to get grounded from reading from the age of a kindergartner until I was old enough that I couldn't get grounded anymore. My parents would take reading away from me. And, you know, this last week, my wife was telling me, she says, we were talking, whenever I talk to people, I usually know a little bit about whatever it is that they're talking about. And I don't remember what it was that we were talking about. And she asked me, how in the world do you know that? It's two or three times this week that it happens. She said, how do you know that? I said, well, I used to read all the time. And I've read biographies of Christian men, and there's a lot of things that you know because you read. And so reading will make you knowledgeable in a way that watching television and that sort of thing just won't. And so I think it's good to teach our young folks to read, but I'll tell you something else. Our young people don't know what communism is. And what history you don't know, you repeat. And so I've been reading some about persecution and communism in our Sunday school so that our young people know that church hasn't always been the way it is. When I was young, we used to partner with people in Russia that would go to prison, be exiled to Siberia for having Bibles in their homes. And you just don't know the grand privilege of freedom. And we'll soon lose it in America, and our people will be more aware of it, I think, than they are at present. But it's a shame to just lose freedom simply by wasting it. I do believe that it's a greater tragedy to waste liberty than it is not to have it. If you don't have it, at least you don't have the responsibility for it. But if you do have it and you do waste it, then of course you'll answer to the Lord for that. So we're in 1 Thessalonians this morning, but if you've got your Sunday school lesson, I'd like to have a time for a quiz. Boy, I guess I ran out of time this morning. I wanted to have some pens and pencils. Everybody have a pen? Eric's got a pen. I've got one pen available. You know what I don't have is a copy of our Sunday school lesson. Here you go. Pastor. Pastor. Okay. Got this. Anyone need pens? We'll go ahead and have our quiz for last week. And here's the quiz. And we'll take about 4 minutes for it. Really shouldn't take any longer than that. It's open Bible. And the quiz from last week is, who needs a pen? Just turn your Sunday school lesson from this morning over. And next week, I know you'll want to take your Sunday school lesson home and study it. So next week, bring your quiz back, and Brother Chris or myself will grade it. And I'll trust you to be on your honor with regard to altering your Sunday school quiz between now and at home. You could cheat, and I'll never know. Brother Chris will never know. So if it doesn't matter to you, it doesn't matter to me. So go ahead and cheat if you'd like to. The quiz for last week is short form. List the outline for the book of, and that'll be it for the quiz time this morning. You can turn, if you're in the adult Sunday school class, you can turn your quiz in to Brother Chris next week. And if you're in the teen class, you can do the same thing. So, and he'll grade those accordingly. That's the quiz for this morning. Now let's go ahead and learn our verse this morning, and it's very, very easy. We've got to get it very quickly. It's 1 Thessalonians chapter 5 and verse 6. And if you want to open your Bibles up to it, it's 1 Thessalonians 5:6.